Up next we have Don't Call It Amal by Genevieve Barrons. Genevieve is the project lead of the Refugee Learning Accelerator project at the MIT Media Lab. The Refugee Learning Accelerator supports computer scientists and engineers from the Middle East to create technologies for refugee learners. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Genevieve to come and talk to us about this project. Thank you.
Good morning. I have the pleasure of standing between you and your lunch, but I'm going to use the next couple of minutes to tell you a little bit about the MIT Media Lab, the program I work for there, and then the specific project that we've spent the last year running. Before I get started, I should define my phrases, or I might give you some definitions. So when I'm talking about technology for good, I'm talking about technology with a social purpose. And I think the key detail there is that the consumer base may not always be able to pay for those services. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've learned and why that's an issue, and I'd actually love your thoughts and feedback on how we can do a better job. So if you can be, I don't know how Slido works, but if you can be contributing questions or ideas there, or we'll have some time for questions at the end. I've been working in the Middle East for a couple of years now, mostly around the issue of refugee education, mostly from an NGO perspective. So coming to MIT was actually a bit of a switch for me. I used to work for a Human Rights Foundation and was very involved in how we can support the countries that are around Syria, which have been bearing such a tremendous burden with the number of refugees, and in particular the number of young learners that are there and that need to be educated. But that's obviously taking a toll on those education systems around the region. So to start, I'd actually like to switch things up a little bit. In classic Media Lab style, I'm going to make you talk to the people near you. So if you can turn to someone you don't know and share one thing you've learned so far this morning.
That people are very important and it could lead to higher speeds. Schools can very
sustainability of the group.
Wonderful. Sustainability is such an important issue. Tarjimli, I recognize your face. What did you learn? What is your name to start?
Aziz. My name is Aziz.
Yes. And what did you learn?
So I actually learned that there's. I was surprised to learn about how Abu Dhabi, the national group, actually had a role in building technology rather than investment, which is always a huge question for me in the Middle East around the investment versus building, sort of like fine line, and that was a very interesting thing to learn. Yeah.
Wonderful. So the reason that I'm particularly interested in this question of learning and what you've been learning this morning is I work for a group at the Media Lab called the Learning Initiative, and what we do is we bring the collective creativity of the Media Lab to bear on the future of learning. What does that actually mean? It means we're very interested in technology, yes, and we're interested in how technology impacts learning. Of course, that's what the Media Lab does. We're interested in the intersection of technology and society. But beyond that, we think that tech alone is not sufficient. So we think that learning should be project-based, passion-based, play-based, and peer-based. What does this actually mean? We call it the 4 Ps. We think that learning is best done when you're doing it with other people, in a group. We think it's best done when it's something you're actually excited about. We think it's best done when it's not just sort of a discrete thing that you're focusing on, but is building towards something bigger and maybe something with real life ramifications. And this is how the Media Lab is structured. And a lot of what the Learning Initiative does is try and take these style of learning experiences, which are so available to students here at MIT, and make them available to people outside the Media Lab and outside of MIT. And so we work with public libraries to make these sorts of learning experiences available. We've developed an online platform which supports unconferences. We work with all sorts of different people to try and make the kind of learning that's common for MIT students accessible outside of MIT. And in the last few years, we were involved in a peripheral way, and there was increasing interest at MIT in this question of refugees and refugee learners and also host communities. And we thought, how can we be involved with that? How can we bring an MIT-style learning experience to refugees and host communities? And we came up with the idea of the Refugee Learning Accelerator. And in my introduction, they read our little tagline, which is that we support engineers and computer scientists from the Middle East to create educational technologies for refugee learners. So we thought we'd take the model of the hackathon and expand it a little bit, and then we would work with the abundance of trained computer scientists from Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and Lebanon. Jordan, I said Lebanon twice in that sentence. And we would see if we could support them to imagine how technology could be used in their own communities to support refugee learners and host communities, which I said. So how can we make media-style learning opportunities available to refugees and host community members? So we came up with this very modified accelerator model. We called it an accelerator, but we were working with teams who maybe hadn't built anything before. They could code, but they hadn't had the opportunity to actually build a project on their own and to own that. We offered them training, mentorship, and funding. We partnered with IDEO to do a lot of human-centered design. We had amazing people, both here at MIT and then in particular in the Middle East, in Jordan. We held a workshop there, and we had just the tech community and the NGO community came together, and we had all these mentors coming. And right now we're in the final phase. So we're working with 6 teams who have developed a product that's aimed to support refugee learners. We've given them a couple of $1,000s in a few months. They're not deploying, they're not at that stage yet, but we're trying to get them actually out in the field, working with refugee learners to do some user testing so that then they can take what they learned doing that and iterate and hopefully continue to develop that product and bring it forward. So yes, the thing we were focusing on is how we might use simple technologies to support refugee learners, and the kind of products our teams came up with were chatbots, mobile applications, and very basic information sharing that could hopefully support teachers and learners working with refugees. So there you have our teams. We had people from across the region, and as well as a bunch of MIT students with us in January in Amal, working on these prototypes. We also did some very important work. We did a randomized control trial of the best kanafe that's available. So some of the things that we were excited about, or we are excited about right now, we put a really big emphasis on community and collaboration over competition. Even though this program was acting like a funnel, so we had many people in an online course at the beginning, fewer people with us in Amal in January, and now even fewer people getting funding. We really wanted it to feel like we were working on something together and that we weren't, the teams weren't sort of in competition with each other. We spent a lot of time learning through letting go. At the end, we asked our teams, what's the hardest thing? What was the thing you learned most about? And they said, giving up our bad ideas. That was something that they hadn't necessarily been pressed to do before, but we spent a lot of time with local NGOs, and they would just say, like, great effort, we're super glad you're here, but honestly that idea will not work, There is not consistent internet at Zaatari refugee camp, or most refugees aren't even in refugee camps. So while these ideas are exciting, like, just once you get them on the ground, they're not workable. And that was something that I think our teams, it was really hard, but they learned a lot through the process. Something else we spent a lot of time doing was thinking about users. As I said, our teams, they're all computer scientists, but they hadn't always had the opportunity or been required to actually think about how their users use that technology. A lot of their training, they seem to sort of start from the tech and then move towards the users, and we said, okay, why don't we start from the users and move towards the tech? So that was something that was difficult, but we did a lot of work on. And then one other thing is there's so many hackathons have happened in the last 2 years thinking about how technology can be used to support refugees, but often these things kind of happen in a bubble. You have a set of facts and maybe some fact sheets that you're working off of, but then you just like come up with an idea and you run with it. And at no point does someone really give you a reality check of how that's actually going to work on the ground. And so we had the pleasure of being supported by a huge number of local NGOs in Amal who came in and gave us their time and would provide some guidance and redirection to our teams over the course of the projects. But what surprised us? As I said, we had all of these amazing people from Amal coming in to talk to us and share their experience. And one of these people happened to be the founder and managing partner of a major venture capital firm in Amal. And he spent the whole afternoon with our teams. He spent like a half an hour with each of them talking through their ideas. And at the end, we grabbed him and said, thank you so much for being here. We're just curious, what were your impressions? What did you learn? And he said, you've got great people here. I'm so excited about the ideas. But why are you encouraging them to have nonprofit business models? That's just totally unworkable. They should be for-profit. And we said, yeah, you run a VC, of course you think that. And he's like, no, I'm really certain of this. In the Middle East, it just doesn't work. Nonprofits, that's not what you want. If you want these people to be successful, you need to be encouraging them to have a for-profit business model, to be consumer-focused. People will figure out how to pay if it's something that's important enough to them. And we said, okay, thanks for your feedback. And kind of moved on. And the next day was our big pitch session, and we had the CEO of one of the largest nonprofits in Jordan there. And she was particularly excited about one of the projects, which was trying to pair Syrian youth with internship opportunities in very specific industries, because there's a lot of rules and regulations around what jobs Syrians can have. And she said, this is such a good idea. My NGO would absolutely use this, but you gotta tell them to change the name. And we said, why? The name is Amal, it means hope in Arabic. We said, it's a nice name, what's wrong with it? And she said, it sounds like an NGO. And in the Middle East, we don't trust NGOs. You gotta tell them to change the name. And we're like, you run an NGO. But her point was that, there's a long history of nonprofits and international NGOs working in the Middle East, and there's a certain reputation. And if you're gonna offer a product that actually delivers, you may not wanna look like an NGO. You may want to look more like a for-profit company because there may be more trust in you at that point. And we said that's a really interesting observation coming from a person that runs a not-for-profit in the Middle East. And one more story. So this is the product of one of our teams. It's called Giddings. It's a mobile app which aims to connect refugee learners with buddies who will read them bedtime stories. So the idea is that there are lots of people in the world who are very interested in being involved with the refugee or supporting refugees. They don't obviously necessarily have a good way to do that. You also have all of these refugee children who are attending school in languages that are not necessarily their first language. They're based in Lebanon. So in Lebanon, obviously the school system is very intensively in English and French in a way that it was not in Syria for many of these children. And so they don't necessarily have someone to practice their language skills with. So they've built this app that a story comes up on your phone, you connect to a child, you can read them the story, you can focus on certain vocabulary, and the idea is to create these buddy partnerships all around the world. And so they've been going around, they've got a working prototype, they're starting to actually user test it to set up buddies and to see how that actually works. And one of the big issues is they need content. So they've been going to publishers in the United States. They were at Scholastic last week in New Jersey and saying, can you give us any content? Like, are there stories that we can include in our app? And Scholastic says, yes, absolutely. Like, here are some stories that you can include in the app, but it absolutely cannot be for profit. So this needs to be like social impact only, you can't be making any money off of this. And then on the other hand, they have a little funding for us, so they're covered for a few months, but they've been looking for funding in the Middle East, and they go to the incubators and the accelerators, and they say, this is a great idea, we can absolutely see parents wanting to use this, but you need to build a for-profit business model. And they're stuck between these two things, where in the West, people want to support a not-for-profit app in the Middle East, and in the Middle East, people are like, why would you build a not-for-profit app? They're like looking for other ideas for business models, for way to structure the content, and to figure out how to do this, but they've been really felt like they've been pulled between these two major things. So, what have I learned? I've learned that there's so much space for tech for good in the Middle East. There's definitely like projects and products that can be created that can have a big impact on people's lives, but we've not figured out how to support that yet. On the one hand, you have the nonprofit world, the world that I come from, and on the other hand, you have tech startups. In an ideal world, this would be a Venn diagram, but right now it's pretty much two circles. Nonprofits are slow and big, and that's a problem if you're a tiny tech startup that wants to do something that probably can't be paid for by consumers but needs other funding. It takes like 6 months often to get funding out of a big NGO, even if they want to fund you. By the time they actually go through all the paperwork and get it in the right, the team and the approval, it's 6 months, and your tech startup's dead because you haven't been able to pay your grocery bills for 6 months. And so how do we figure out how to make funding more readily available from the nonprofit world for the tech for good startups? Or how do we figure out how to make this tech startup world more sort of amenable towards nonprofit technology? And then the other thing I've noticed is that the nonprofits are super interested in your app or your tech for good if you're at scale. But if you're a tiny little startup that has an idea and a dream and a sort of a path forward, but maybe doesn't yet have 100 users, the nonprofits aren't really that interesting. They scale. That's what you hear from nonprofits, and that's what they want to be supporting. So how do you either create a pathway that allows for other kinds of funding before you actually hit the big nonprofit funding? Or how do you create something that looks more like the for-profit world where people are willing to take risks? Risk is really hard for NGOs because at the end of the day, they're responsible to a donor and they have to write a report. And it's not like a VC where you can say we had 10 projects and 9 failed, but one's awesome. There's just not that sort of flexibility. So how do we start building that flexibility in? So the thing that I'm interested in and thinking a lot about, and I'd love to hear from you, either if you have questions now or over the lunch in the next little bit, is how we can best support early stage tech for good and limited ecosystem with low trust in the nonprofit industry. That's what I got. Thanks.
We'll be taking a few questions from the audience if time permits. So the first one is, how can refugees not only be educated, but also have opportunities that recognize their education and potential?
That's a really big question. So one of the ways we tried to do this was that we included refugees in our cohort. So we had about 7 Syrians and 2 Palestinians that were actually, they're trained, Syria was a developed country. There are people with amazing education and experience, and so creating opportunities for them to use that education and experience in support of their own country, I think is important. I think we need to change the way we recognize education is a big part of this. Right now, education across the world, but in particular in the Middle East, I think is we don't have a good way of recognizing skills. We recognize paperwork. So how do you figure out how, instead of worrying about whether someone graduated from XYZ university, you figure out what they can actually do? I know for many Syrians, they left Syria without paperwork because, of course, you don't go and necessarily remember to grab your high school transcript when you're fleeing a country. But then you show up in Lebanon or Germany or Greece, and people say, well, prove it. Prove that you have a university degree. And so you have people with, good educations who all of a sudden can't actually use those educations to provide for their families or or to be employed. So I think this issue of recognition is a big one and very important and something that we've totally failed on.
All right. So we can also take questions from the audience if you don't want to use Slido. I think Dr. Anderson.
Actually, it's a comment. That's why I didn't write it on Slido, because I'd be writing. And so I just want to comment on your question. That's a really good question. And I think to answer it, you need to have knowledge on the ground. And I'm just going to offer some information from the ground. I'm from Jordan. My name is Rana Dajani. I work at the University in Jordan. I'm a professor, and I have my own local NGO in Jordan. So I relate to exactly what's going on the ground. So I think the reason there's lack of trust in NGOs in general, in Jordan or in the Arab world, one, either they're huge NGOs that are actually not local, they're international, and so what is their agenda? I mean, we all know they're coming in with good intention, but people will always question, who are you, why are you doing this, and so on, and what is your purpose? So those are some NGOs that I can understand that kind of perspective. The other are the really local ones that are Jordanian or Lebanese, and also you're not sure because like in Jordan I know there's 8,000 local NGOs registered with the Ministry of Social Affairs, and I want to say 90% actually don't function. So I can understand that kind of lack of. So to me, the answer is, and to go to for-profit is another problem, like you said, internationally. So where's the answer? So the answer from experience is you go and find the social entrepreneurs. All right, because those social entrepreneurs are people who have been able to navigate that kind of landmine. They're not for profit, they are non-profit, but they're entrepreneurs. So they're actually, they have something concrete that they're offering society to build trust, and they're local.
Yeah.
So when they're local, you eliminate the large NGOs, and when they're local, but they have a real program, it's not just about creating an NGO, they are trusted by the people. So that, to me, it's about looking for those people who have good ideas socially, and then building on those to create the solutions and so on.
Hi, my name is Michelle Shimmer. I'm an engineer, I have nothing to do with NGOs, but I do follow INADA. I'm sure you've heard of INADA. Mm-hmm. So what if you get an affiliation, because INADA's, as you know, is Arwa Damon's NGO for Syrian refugees. What if you get an affiliation with an existing NGO that backs you up? That way you have that credibility to the larger NGOs globally or wherever. And in doing so, it allows you to access the networks that INADA has and several others to be able to fund it and so forth. Additionally, I think the point with the social entrepreneurs is extremely critical because a lot of people do have this empathy towards what's going on in Syria, and therefore they would like to make that effort. Third element is, unfortunately in today's world, a lot of people want to have this social media presence, and it's a lot of advertising, whether it's for a specific company or an individual, like boasting, like, yeah, you know, I support this place, and so forth. Use that to your advantage. Go for people that could potentially be superficial enough to want that, I'm boasting myself, use it to your advantage and be able to have them fund you and say, hey, this guy is funding us and we're doing great things. I think these are some elements that can assist in the advancement of this whole gap between a profit and a non-profit.
Cool. Thank you for the ideas. There's a super important question on here about kanafe. I'm going to tell you cheese, and it's got to be hot. I do not like the cold kanafe.
Do you want to answer some?
What do you define as success for your accelerator companies? So I think the word company is a little bit of a stretch. We're still calling them teams. They're not MIT, like this is not a typical MIT accelerator where you come out and they're like ready to go, ready to hit the market. What we've defined as success, we are defining as success. I have like a whole list on this, and of course now it's all fled my mind. But so we want them to be actually working with users. We want them to have taken their technology into the field and to have tested it with users, and we want them to have built a successful partnership with an NGO. So one of the conditions for, and this may be for better or for worse, like this is part of what I was asking you about and talking about today, but one of the conditions for funding was that they find an NGO who actually believed in what they had built enough to want to use it with the group that they work with. Because we thought that was a pretty good metric for determining if something was actually useful. Instead of just funding an idea. We were saying, find an NGO that believes in this enough to say, yeah, you can come to work in our office space, or we'll give you some support and some resources. So those were probably the two main things. Yeah.
So quick question, you mentioned, thanks for the insight, by the way, it's very insightful. I would love to hear from you around, you talked about trust a lot. And I want to hear from you, and another point that came about trust is this concept of scale. You're saying NGOs, you're a small team. For me, that sounds also like a trust issue. You know, I don't invest resource in you, tomorrow you'll disappear. What do you guys do to these people on the ground to sort of like bolster that trust that NGOs have from, how do you make them look more credible? What do you guys do to convince people that, look, this is not a hobbyist that will disappear tomorrow, this is someone who's interested in creating a long impact, specifically for these, for in the context of the Middle East, because I think that's very interesting.
I think a lot of the trust came down to like person to person, like actually being there, talking to people. The NGO community in Amman is not huge, so it was a lot about actually like meeting people in person and introducing them to our teams and having them come and talk to our teams. And that worked pretty well at the ideate stage, but now we're like encountering the whole infrastructure of the NGO that exists above the individuals that are actually in Amman. So, you may have awesome people working for UNHCR or the Norwegian Refugee Council or Atrak or the Queen Rania Foundation in Amman, but when you like go to the finance people, suddenly they're people that are elsewhere in the world and you don't know them. So that's something we're trying to figure out, is like the person-to-person relationships work for getting someone to come and give you some of their time and expertise, but in terms of actually like integrating, suddenly you're dealing with a much larger bureaucracy, and that's where like the slowness comes in, and then like the problems with funding that we're having right now.
All right, so I think that's all we have time for today. If you want to quickly address this last Slido question, though it is something that probably, if whoever asked this wants to ask Genevieve during lunch, I think she'd be open to that as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.